Toronto is the capital city of the province of Ontario in southeastern Canada. It is the most populous city in Canada, a multicultural city, and the country's financial and commercial centre. Its location on the northwestern shore of Lake Ontario, which forms part of the border between Canada and the United States, and its access to Atlantic shipping via the St. Lawrence Seaway, and to major U.S. industrial centres via the Great Lakes, have enabled Toronto to become an important international trading centre. Moreover, the city is positioned on the edge of some of the best farmland in Canada, with a climate favourable to growing a wide range of crops, thereby making Toronto a transportation, distribution, and manufacturing centre. Most importantly, its central location, along with a host of political policies favoring international trade, places this city with the greatest economic ties to and influence from the United States. Since the second half of the 20th century, the city has grown phenomenally from a rather sedate provincial town, Toronto the Good, to a lively, thriving, cosmopolitan metropolitan area. A major increase in the population of Toronto, nearly fourfold expansion, from 1.3 million in 1951 to over 5 million by 2006, and national economic growth influenced the city skyline, which is dominated by the CN Tower, a communications and observation spire 1,815 feet high, as well as by the First Canadian Place, Bank of Montreal, Scotia Plaza Canada Trust Tower, Manulife Centre, Commerce Court, Toronto Dominion Centre, and Bay Adelaide Centre, each of which is more than 50 stories high. Other prominent buildings include City Hall, 1965, Eaton Centre, a large indoor shopping complex, the Gilded Royal Bank Plaza, the Toronto Reference Library, the Ontario Science Centre, the Royal Ontario Museum, with its crystal-shaped facade, and Roy Thomson Hall, noted for its excellent acoustics. The city also features an extensive system of underground tunnels and concourses lined with shops, restaurants, and theaters. Through the construction of new housing and mixed-use projects, together with the restoration and rehabilitation of heritage buildings, extraordinary vitality has been brought to the urban core. The city's lakefront is separated from the downtown area by railway tracks and the Gardiner Expressway. However, there are many points of access to the waterfront, which is almost entirely public space and includes Sunnyside Pool, Balmy Beach Park, and the Waterfront Bike Trail. East of downtown, surrounding Kew Gardens, the area is known as the Beach, or the Beaches, appears more like a resort town than a neighborhood in a big city. In the harbourfront neighborhood, ferry service connects the dock area to the Toronto Islands, about half a mile, 4/5 of a kilometre, offshore, which have yacht clubs, an airport, recreational facilities, and a residential community. Toronto is a city with scores of neighborhoods, some of which have identities that have been imposed upon them by realtors, whereas others are of much longer standing and have a more distinctive character. West of the central business district, following Queen Street W, is West Queen West, once a trendy bohemian section, now a more mainstream shopping district. Northeast of this area is two of Toronto's best-known neighborhoods, Chinatown and Kensington Market, the latter of which features an eclectic mix of shops and restaurants that reflect the city's multicultural diversity. Still farther north, beyond the campus of the University of Toronto, is the Annex, a residential area that is home to many students and is the site of a number of attractive 19th-century homes. North of the Annex, on a hill overlooking Davenport Road, is Casa Loma, the turreted castle-like mansion built in 1911-14 for $3.5 million Canadian by Sir Henry Pellet. East of the Annex is the fashionable Yorkville-Cumberland boutique shopping area, to the south of which are Queen's Park and the Ontario Parliament Building. Large expanses of grass and tall shade trees make this a pleasant area, complementing the ravines that form so important an element in the metropolitan park system. To the northeast of Queen's Park is Rosedale, one of the most attractive residential areas in Toronto. It is an older neighborhood of dignified houses and winding tree-lined streets quite close to the downtown center, which itself contains many attractive streets of modest, well-designed houses. South of Rosedale and bounded on the north by St. James Cemetery and on the east by the Don River is Cabbage Town, which takes its name from the cabbages that were once grown on lawns in this neighborhood that is now the site of many beautifully restored vintage residences. Farther south, abutting the Gardiner Expressway, is the Distillery District, where brick-paved pedestrian walkways wind through architecturally significant Victorian-era industrial buildings that house restaurants, shops, and theaters. Immediately to the west, at the core of Old Town Toronto, is the St. Lawrence Market neighborhood, a district of red and yellow brick Georgian structures centered on the historic Market Building, founded 1803, that gives the area its name. Toronto's growth and demographic makeup were influenced by many political and economic events that affected the whole province of Ontario. After the American Revolution, Ontario was referred to as a Loyalist creation because of the influx of English-speaking Protestants and a number of First Nations that chose to live in British North America. Immigration continued, slowly to begin with, but then much more rapidly through transportation improvements that placed Toronto as a key transportation and industrial center. Many of the immigrants were from across Europe as well as the United States. Still, the population remained largely English-speaking and Protestant. Following World War II, Toronto was a magnet for thousands of new immigrants, many coming from Europe during the 1950s and 60s. Immigration laws had become more flexible by the 1970s, thus opening the door to a flood of new arrivals, particularly South Asians and Chinese. By the time of the 2006 census, more than half of the Toronto metropolitan area was made up of visible minorities, making Toronto a truly cosmopolitan city. Canada and the world experienced significant periods of economic depression during the 20 years from the mid-1870s to the mid-1890s. Many countries employed protectionist policies in an attempt to safeguard manufacturing jobs, and Canada was no exception. The National Policy of 1879 imposed high tariffs on imported consumer products. The advantage to Toronto was that Canadians were forced to buy domestic-made goods. This prevented U.S. products from crossing the border, but not U.S. firms. The policy allowed U.S. and British companies to set up branch plants in Canada. Toronto, with its well-established ties and close proximity to the manufacturing belt of the United States, benefited greatly from this policy as many U.S. companies established plants in the city. The national policy also promoted railway construction to tie Western Canada to Toronto and Montreal. New rail lines, the Canadian Pacific Railway, or CPR, completed to Vancouver by 1886, and new people, mainly farmers, translated into demands for a range of goods from steel to housing and farming supplies. Toronto's manufacturing sector produced many of these goods and also processed many agricultural products, its pork packing plants earning Toronto the name Hog Town. Toronto became a national retail sales market owing to the location thereof the T. Eaton Company Limited, known as Eaton's, 1869, and the Robert Simpson Company Limited, known as Simpsons, built in 1872, as both department stores developed catalog sales whose network expanded in relationship to railway development. The Temiskaming and Northern Railway, renamed Ontario Northland Railway, financed by Toronto entrepreneurs and the provincial government in the early 1900s, allowed Toronto to tap into the minerals and forests of northern Ontario and, with branch lines, northern Quebec. Again, Toronto became the main supply and service center for the northern communities. World War I resulted in the manufacturing of munitions and other war supplies and increased employment, often with women workers. A natural harbor links to Montreal, and even stronger ties to the US, and a hinterland rich in resources, gave Toronto some distinct economic advantages. By the 1970s, globalization had begun to take its toll on manufacturing industries, especially labor-intensive industries such as clothing, shoe, and textile manufacturing. These industries moved to labor-cheap regions of the world. As the capital of Canada's most populous province, the city has a widely diversified economy. Ontario produces more than half of Canada's manufactured goods and most of its manufactured exports. It has immense resources of raw materials, minerals, timber, water, and agricultural products. Toronto gained importance as a financial center with the headquarters of several banks and a dominant stock exchange capitalizing on the many metal mines being opened in Canada generally and in the Canadian Shield to the north particularly. By the 1980s, manufacturing jobs in Toronto had become more specialized, e.g. electronics, and the main shift was to service employment as Toronto became a major financial, administration, real estate, insurance, educational, wholesaling, retailing, and tourist destination center. The city gained national financial supremacy, housing 5 of the 6 national banks. The Toronto Stock Exchange, C, became part of a publicly traded company, the Toronto-based TSX Group Incorporated, in 2002. The exchange adopted TSX as its abbreviation in 2004. The TSX Group also acquired the Canadian Venture Exchange, comprising the former Vancouver and Alberta Stock Exchanges, and the Montreal Exchange, Bourse de Montréal. TSX itself is one of the largest stock exchanges in North America in value of trading. The influx of people resulted in higher density core development as well as suburbanization, and both increased the need for public transportation, which has a long history in this city. A horse-drawn omnibus service was in place as early as 1849, but was replaced by the horse-drawn streetcar by 1861. The rail lines expanded, and streetcars became electrified by the 1890s. The system of streetcar lines was rather uncoordinated because of the mix of private and publicly owned lines until the consolidation of all lines by the city in 1921. Toronto is home to two airports. Both were established in 1938, and each has undergone a number of upgrades to runways and terminals as well as name changes. In close proximity to the heart of the city is Toronto Islands Airport, initially the Port George VI Airport, which had its name changed to Toronto City Centre Airport in 1994, and since 2009 has been known as the Billy Bishop Toronto City Airport. Toronto's International Airport is located some 20 miles (30 kilometers) to the west of the city, in the community of Malton, and therefore was called the Malton Airport until being designated Toronto International Airport in 1960 and later, in 1984, Toronto Pearson International Airport, named after Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson. The city is an important cultural centre. The Toronto Symphony Orchestra and other musical groups have an international reputation. There are 4 major theatres, together with many smaller theatres and theatre companies, including the Factory Theatre, which is Canada's largest producer of exclusively Canadian plays, and Canadian Stage, which performs in several theatres. The Art Gallery of Ontario and the Royal Ontario Museum have excellent collections, and there are numerous privately owned galleries. Other attractions include the Ontario Science Centre, with its imaginative working exhibits, and Ontario Place, a large complex of recreational facilities on man-made islands that are an extension to the permanent Canadian National Exhibition. Since World War II, Toronto has attracted residents from all over the world. Unlike the American melting pot, Toronto is more of a tossed salad of diverse ethnic groups. Finally, Toronto is a city that must be put on the bucket list of places to visit. And I wish you all the best, and see you in another video.